I remember the exact moment Dr. Richard Calloway stopped chewing. He had his fork halfway to his mouth, a piece of filet mignon still balanced on the tines, and his face carried the same confident expression he'd worn for the past 45 minutes while explaining to me slowly, patiently, the way you might explain long division to a child how cardiac surgery actually works. He had just finished saying that most young people today don't understand the discipline it takes to hold a human heart in your hands and make life or death decisions in seconds. And I had just finished saying, very quietly, that I understood perfectly, because I would be taking over his former department on Monday morning as the new chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Hartford Memorial. The fork never made it to his mouth. But to understand how we arrived at that particular silence, how a Saturday dinner in a colonial house in Glastonbury, Connecticut turned into the most uncomfortable evening of Richard Calloway's retirement, you need to go back about 10 days. I had just accepted the position at Hartford Memorial, chief of cardiothoracic surgery. At 33 years old, I was the youngest department chief in the hospital's history, and I knew exactly what that meant. It meant some people would celebrate the appointment, and others would spend the next 6 months waiting for me to fail. I had been a surgeon long enough to understand that credibility in medicine is measured in gray hairs and decades, and I had neither. What I did have was a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, 3 years as lead surgeon at a level eye trauma center in Baltimore, a published technique for minimally invasive mitral valve repair that had changed the standard of care in 4 states, and the kind of stubbornness that keeps you standing through a 9-hour operation when everyone else wants to quit. None of that shows up when you're sitting across from someone at a dinner table wearing a sundress and no name badge. Ethan Calloway and I had been together for 2 years. He worked in medical device sales, which is how we met. He was presenting a new catheter system at a conference in Philadelphia, and I was the surgeon in the audience who asked the question that made him redesign his entire pitch deck. He asked me to dinner that night. I said no. He asked again the next morning. I said I'd think about it. He sent me a peer-reviewed study on the cardiovascular benefits of social dining. I laughed and said yes. Ethan was kind, steady, the sort of man who remembered your coffee order and never once asked me to choose between him and a surgery that ran past midnight. He knew what I did. He was proud of what I did. But outside the hospital, we were just Nora and Ethan. Weekends were for hiking trails in the Berkshires, not discussing aortic valve replacements. About a week after I signed the contract with Hartford Memorial, Ethan came over to my apartment with Thai takeout, and that particular look he gets when he's building up to something uncomfortable. We ate in relative quiet for a few minutes before he set his chopsticks down. My parents want to meet you. I smiled. That's reasonable. We've been together 2 years. He nodded. Yeah, I waited. There was clearly more. My dad is particular, Ethan said. Particular how? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, 35 years at Hartford Memorial, retired last year. I set down my fork. Hartford Memorial, yeah, the hospital where I had just been named department chief. And he doesn't know about my appointment, I said. Ethan shook his head slowly. He doesn't know you're a surgeon at all. I stared at him. What does he think I do? Ethan winced. I may have told him you work in healthcare administration. Healthcare administration. It wasn't entirely a lie. You do administrate things. Occasionally. Ethan. He held up his hands. Look, you have to understand my father. He spent 35 years as the top cardiac surgeon in the state. He built that department from a 3-room wing into one of the best programs in New England. Surgery isn't just his career, it's his entire identity. And, Ethan exhaled, and he has very strong opinions about who should be running that department after him. He wanted his protege, Dr. Marcus Webb, to take over. When the board chose someone else, someone from outside the hospital, he took it personally. Someone from outside the hospital, I repeated, meaning me. He doesn't know it's you. He just knows the board picked a younger surgeon from Baltimore, and he's been furious about it for weeks. I leaned back in my chair. So, your father has been complaining about my appointment, and you haven't told him that the person he's complaining about is the woman you've been dating for 2 years. Ethan looked genuinely miserable. When you put it like that, it sounds really bad. It sounds bad because it is bad. I know, but I wanted him to meet you as Nora first, not as the person who replaced him. That answer softened me more than I wanted it to. I understood the instinct, the desire to let someone be seen before being judged. But I also knew that secrets in families are like undiagnosed conditions. They only get worse the longer you ignore them. "When's dinner?" I asked. "Saturday." "Fine." Ethan blinked. "Fine? Just like that?" I've operated on beating hearts while alarms were screaming and nurses were praying. "I think I can handle your father over a meal." He laughed, but there was worry behind it. "You don't know my dad." "I've met surgeons before, Ethan. I am one. He's not just any surgeon. He's the kind who corrects waiters on the proper way to hold a steak knife. Charming. Just, if he starts lecturing, try not to. Correct him? Outperform him? Mention that I literally hold the job he thinks belongs to someone else?" Ethan closed his eyes. "Any of those, yes." The drive to Glastonbury took 40 minutes. Connecticut in October is almost unreasonably beautiful. Maple trees turned copper and gold along the Merritt Parkway, and the late afternoon light made everything look like a painting someone forgot to finish. Old stone walls, white church steeples, neighborhoods where the houses have names instead of numbers. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel, quiet the way people get when they're rehearsing conversations in their head. "You're nervous," I said. "I'm terrified." "That's a strong word for dinner with your own parents. You haven't met my father. Tell me what to expect." Ethan thought for a moment. "He'll be polite at first, charming even. My dad can be very charismatic when he wants to be, but once the conversation turns to medicine, and it always turns to medicine, he becomes a professor. He can't help it. 35 years of being the smartest person in every operating room does something to your conversational style. Meaning he lectures. Meaning he holds court." We pulled onto a tree-lined street. The Calloway house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a large colonial with dark green shutters, a perfectly maintained lawn, and a brass knocker on the front door shaped like a caduceus. Of course it was. "Ready?" Ethan asked. "I've walked into trauma bays with less preparation than this. Let's go." Richard Calloway opened the door before we reached the porch. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing over operating tables. Even in a casual button-down and khakis, he carried himself like a man accustomed to being in charge of every room he entered. "Ethan." His handshake with his son was brief and firm. "Dad, this is Nora." Richard's eyes shifted to me. He studied me the way senior surgeons study new residents quickly, clinically, already forming an assessment. "Nora," he said. "Welcome." "Thank you, Dr. Calloway." "Richard, please. We're not at the hospital." Behind him, Diane Calloway appeared. She was warm where Richard was precise, with kind eyes and a smile that immediately made me feel like I'd been expected for years, not weeks. "You brought her," she said to Ethan, pulling him into a hug. Then she turned to me and took both my hands. "I have been waiting to meet the woman who convinced my son to stop eating frozen dinners." I laughed. It was a gradual process. The house smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic. I noticed the details as we walked to the dining room, framed diplomas along the hallway. Photographs of Richard in surgical scrubs through the decades. A glass case displaying various medical honors and awards. One entire wall was devoted to Hartford Memorial. Groundbreaking ceremonies, department photos, Richard shaking hands with hospital board members and Connecticut governors. Richard noticed me looking. 35 years, he said simply. "That's an extraordinary career." He nodded once. The way people do when they agree with something they already know. The dining room table was set with care. White tablecloth, cloth napkins, a centerpiece of autumn flowers. Diane brought out filet mignon, roasted asparagus, and a potato gratin that smelled like it had been cooking for hours. Richard opened a bottle of Burgundy and poured with the precision of a man who believes even wine deserves surgical attention. For the first few minutes, everything was pleasant. Diane asked where I grew up, Ohio, small town outside Columbus. Ethan mentioned a weekend trip we'd taken to Vermont. Richard talked about the changing leaves and how Glastonbury's maples were the finest in the state. But slowly, predictably, the conversation drifted. "So, Nora," Richard said, swirling his wine. "Ethan tells me you work in healthcare." "That's right. Administration side," he said. "Mostly coordination. Systems, planning, operations." Richard nodded. "Important work. People don't realize how much of medicine depends on the people behind the scenes." "It's a team effort," I said. It is. He paused. Though I'll say this, the real decisions, the ones that matter, those happen in the operating room. I took a sip of wine and said nothing. Richard continued, I spent 35 years in cardiac surgery. Opened chests, repaired hearts, made calls that determined whether someone lived or died. He said this without arrogance. Exactly. It was more like a weather report, simply stating facts about the world as he understood it. That must have been extraordinary, I said. It was. And exhausting. But the thing people outside the OR never understand is what it feels like to be the last line of defense. When a patient is coding on the table and every second counts, that's not administration. That's instinct. Ethan shifted in his seat. Richard leaned back slightly. You probably see some of that from the administrative side. The aftermath, the paperwork. I see quite a bit, I said. He smiled. I'm sure you do. But there's a difference between reading about a storm and standing in one. Diane gave him a careful look. Richard, what? I'm making conversation. The meal continued. Richard told a story about a surgery from the late 90s, a triple bypass on a patient everyone else had given up on. The story was genuinely compelling. He was a talented storyteller, and I could see the skill behind the words, the surgeon's mind that organized chaos into clean narratives with clear outcomes. But as the evening progressed, the tone shifted. What started as storytelling became instruction. The thing about cardiac surgery, Richard said, cutting his steak with surgical precision, is that it rewards patience. Young doctors today want to rush everything. They trust the technology too much. Technology has improved outcomes significantly, I offered. Richard waved his hand. In some cases, but I've seen residents rely so heavily on imaging that they've forgotten how to use their own hands. You can't scan your way out of a crisis. That's a fair concern. He seemed encouraged by my agreement. Let me give you an example. When I was training, we didn't have half the tools they have now. We learned by doing. Thousands of hours in the OR, hands in chest cavities, feeling the tissue, understanding the anatomy not from a screen but from touch. I nodded. Every word he said was true. It was also information I had known since my second year of medical school. Richard poured himself more wine. The real problem, he continued, is leadership. Running a surgical department isn't just about being a competent surgeon. It's about judgment. Knowing which cases to take, which residents to trust, when to push, and when to step back. That's true, I said. And that kind of judgment only comes from decades of experience. You can't teach it in a fellowship. You can't fast-track it. Ethan cleared his throat. Dad, maybe we could. Richard held up a hand. I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm just stating facts. Diane focused very carefully on her asparagus. Richard looked at me again. You work in hospital administration, so you see the hiring decisions. You probably understand what I mean when I say that leadership positions should go to the people who've earned them. I met his eyes. I do understand that. Good. Because what's happening at my hospital right now, well, my former hospital is exactly what I'm talking about. The air in the room changed slightly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard continued. They're bringing in someone new to run cardiothoracic, some surgeon from Baltimore, young, barely in their mid-30s. I heard about that, Diane said quietly, trying to signal something with her eyes. Richard didn't notice. 35 years I spent building that department, and the board decided to hand it to someone who probably has less operating time than my most junior fellow had when I retired. You don't know that, Ethan said. I know enough. Marcus Webb trained under me for 12 years. He knows the department, knows the staff, knows the patients, and they passed him over for an outsider. I set my fork down gently. Richard shook his head. This is what happens when hospital boards make decisions based on optics instead of substance. They want someone who looks good in a press release instead of someone who can actually run an operating room. Diane spoke softly. Richard, this might not be the right conversation for dinner. Why not? It's the truth. He looked at me again. You're in administration, Nora. You've seen this happen. Boards making political hires instead of choosing the best candidate. It depends on the situation, I said carefully. It doesn't. Surgery is not politics. The best surgeon should lead the department. Period. He tapped the table lightly. Experience matters. Time in the OR matters. You don't hand a department like that to someone who hasn't put in the years. I took a slow breath. Ethan looked like he was calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit. Richard continued. I don't blame this new surgeon. Whoever they are, they probably think they deserve it. Young people always do. But there's a difference between talent and readiness, and most people don't understand that until it's too late. The silence after that sentence was heavy. Diane looked at me with something between sympathy and gentle panic. Ethan stared at his plate. Richard took another sip of wine, satisfied with his analysis. I folded my napkin beside my plate and placed my hands on the table. Richard, I said. Yes? I appreciate your perspective, and I understand why this matters to you. He nodded. It matters because excellence matters. It does. I paused for one beat. Which is why the board reviewed over 90 candidates before making their decision. Richard frowned slightly. How would you know that? Because I was one of those candidates. The room contracted. Richard set his wine glass down. I continued, keeping my voice steady. My name is Dr. Nora Ellison. I completed my fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins. I spent 3 years as lead surgeon at the Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore, where I performed over 400 cardiac procedures, including a minimally invasive mitral valve technique that I developed, and that has since been adopted by 6 major hospitals on the East Coast. No one moved. I was offered the position of Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Hartford Memorial 3 weeks ago, I said. I accepted. I start Monday. The only sound in the room was the grandfather clock in the hallway marking seconds that felt like hours. Richard Calloway stared at me. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been anger, and then finally, the slow, dawning recognition of a man who realizes he has spent the last hour undermining his son's girlfriend to her face about her own job. You're the new chief, he said. Yes. He looked at Ethan. You knew. Ethan nodded. I knew. Richard looked back at me. Then at his wine. Then at the table. Then at the framed photographs of himself on the hallway wall. Well, he said quietly, that's something. Diane pressed her hand to her mouth. Whether she was holding back a gasp or a laugh, I genuinely couldn't tell. Richard sat very still for a long moment. Then he asked, the mitral valve technique, that was you? Yes. I read that paper. I know. It was published in the Journal of Thoracic Surgery 18 months ago. Richard nodded slowly. I remember. I told Marcus it was one of the most elegant approaches I'd seen in 20 years. Thank you. Another silence. This one lasted longer than the others. Finally, Richard leaned back and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry 35 years of assumptions out of his chest. I suppose, he said. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Richard. Yes, I do. He looked me in the eye. I spent the entire evening explaining surgery to a surgeon who is apparently more accomplished at 33 than most people are at twice that age. Diane spoke softly. Richard, breathe. He ignored her, still looking at me. Why didn't you say something earlier? Because I wanted to meet you as Ethan's girlfriend, not as your replacement. That word replacement landed harder than I intended. Richard flinched slightly, not from anger, but from something deeper. The recognition that the world he built was continuing without him, and the person carrying it forward was sitting across his dinner table. I'm not replacing what you built, I said gently. I'm building on it. Richard nodded once. Then again. That's a kind thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say. Your department's reputation is the reason I accepted the position. He looked surprised. Really? Hartford Memorial's cardiac program was on every shortlist I reviewed. That doesn't happen by accident. That's 35 years of someone caring deeply about every detail. Richard stared at his plate for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were different, softer. The confidence was still there, but the sharp edge had dulled. Well, he said, I feel like an absolute fool. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Dad. No. Let me sit with this for a minute. Richard rubbed his forehead. I spent an hour lecturing the chief of cardiothoracic surgery about how cardiac surgery works. Diane reached across the table and touched his hand. If it helps, the asparagus turned out beautifully. Despite everything, Richard laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprised even him. After dinner, Diane and Ethan disappeared into the kitchen. I stepped onto the back patio. The Connecticut evening had turned cool, and the yard was quiet except for wind moving through the maples. The sky was that particular shade of deep blue that autumn brings to New England, and somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was burning wood in a fireplace. The patio door opened behind me. Richard walked out carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without a word, then stood beside me, looking out at the darkening trees. "Ethan's mother makes terrible coffee," he said. "Don't tell her I said that." I smiled, noted. We stood in silence for a moment. "I've been replaying this evening in my head," he said. "Every single sentence." "That sounds painful." "It is." He took a sip of coffee. "I told you that young doctors rely too much on technology." "You did." "And that leadership can't be fast-tracked." "Also true." "And that the board made a political hire." I didn't respond to that one. Richard sighed. "I didn't know you. I didn't bother to know you. I decided who you were before you sat down at my table." "You decided who the new chief was before you met her," I said. "That's different from deciding who I am." He considered that. "Is it?" "I think so. You weren't angry at me. You were grieving something." Richard looked at me sharply. "Grieving? You spent 35 years in that operating room. You built something extraordinary. And then you left, and the world kept turning. That's a loss, Richard. It's okay to feel it." He didn't say anything for a long time. The wind moved through the yard. A leaf drifted down from the maple above us and landed silently on the patio stones. "My wife has been telling me that for a year," he said quietly. I didn't listen. Surgeons are notoriously bad listeners. He gave a short laugh. "That's true." Another pause. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Why did you stay calm?" "All through dinner, I was condescending and dismissive, and you just sat there and nodded." "Why?" "I thought about it. Because you weren't trying to be cruel. You were trying to protect something you love." Richard looked at me for a long moment. "You're more patient than I deserve. Patience is a surgical skill." He smiled at that. Then he set his coffee down on the railing. "I owe you more than an apology." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you're willing, I'd like to help." "Help how?" Richard straightened slightly. "I know that department better than anyone alive. I know which nurses are indispensable, which residents have potential, which equipment needs replacing. I know the culture, the politics, the history." He paused. "And I know that walking into a department as an outsider, especially a young outsider, is one of the hardest things a surgeon can do." I studied him. "Are you offering to be my mentor?" "I'm offering to be useful," he said. "If you'll let me." I considered the offer. 12 hours ago, this man was dismissing my competence over dinner rolls. Now he was standing on his patio, humbled and genuine, offering to share decades of institutional knowledge. "I would appreciate that, Richard." He nodded, and something in his posture released not defeat, but relief. The relief of a man who had found a way to stay connected to the thing he loved most. "One condition," I added. "What's that?" "You have to stop calling me the outsider from Baltimore." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Ethan told you I said that?" "Ethan tells me everything, eventually." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." The patio door opened again. Ethan stepped out, looking between us cautiously. "Everything okay out here?" "Your girlfriend just hired me as a consultant," Richard said. Ethan blinked. "She what?" "Unpaid, of course," Richard added. "I'm retired." I caught Ethan's eye and smiled. "Well," Ethan said slowly, "that's not how I expected this evening to go." "That makes 2 of us," Richard said. The following Saturday, Ethan and I drove back to Glastonbury. Same street, same colonial house, same brass caduceus on the door. But the feeling in the car was entirely different. "Nervous?" I asked. Ethan shook his head. "Relieved, actually." Richard opened the door before we reached the porch. This time, he stepped forward immediately. "No studying, no clinical assessment." "Nora," he said. And his handshake was different, warm, deliberate, the handshake of a colleague rather than a skeptic. Diane appeared behind him. "Well," she said, "I see we're all behaving like civilized people this week." "Apparently," Richard said dryly. The dining room was set exactly as before. Same tablecloth, same autumn flowers. Even the menu was identical: filet mignon, asparagus, potato gratin. Richard noticed me noticing. "Diane's idea." Diane shrugged. "If we're going to overwrite a memory, we should start from the same place." Before the meal began, Richard stood. The room went quiet. "Before we eat," he said, I'd like to say something. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. Richard looked directly at me. Last Saturday, I made assumptions about a woman I'd never met. I dismissed her experience, questioned her qualifications, and lectured her about a field she knows better than almost anyone in this state. The room was still. I was wrong. Not because Nora outranks me or has more credentials. I was wrong because I forgot the most basic thing I used to teach my residents. He paused. Respect the patient before you read the chart. See the person before you see the diagnosis. Diane's eyes glistened. I didn't see Nora, Richard continued. I saw my own fear. Fear that everything I built was being handed to someone who didn't understand its value. And instead of asking questions, I gave lectures. He looked at Ethan. Your mother has informed me that I'll be hearing about this for the next decade. At minimum, Diane confirmed. Richard turned back to me. Nora, I'm proud of what I built at Hartford Memorial, but after meeting you, I'm even prouder of what it's going to become. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. Thank you, Richard, I said. He sat down, picked up his wine glass, and raised it slightly. To the new chief. To the department you built, I replied. Diane wiped her eyes. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. Dinner was different this time. Richard asked real questions about my surgical approach, about the changes I was planning, about the residents I'd be mentoring. He listened. Actually listened. And when I described the technique I'd developed for minimally invasive valve repair, he leaned forward with the focused attention of a surgeon hearing something that genuinely impressed him. That's elegant, he said. Truly. I had good teachers, I said. You had good instincts, he corrected. Teachers only get you so far. After dessert, Richard and I ended up alone in his study. The walls were lined with medical texts and framed photographs spanning 4 decades. He pulled an old photo album from a shelf. First day as department chief, he said, showing me a picture of himself at 38, standing in front of Hartford Memorial with a look of barely contained terror on his face. You look nervous, I said. I was terrified. He closed the album. Everybody is, at first. The trick is not letting the residents see it. I smiled. I'll remember that. He returned the album to the shelf and turned to me. You know what surprised me most about last week? What? It wasn't the embarrassment. It wasn't even the rank. What was it? It was realizing that the best thing I could do for the department I love wasn't to fight for it. He paused. It was to let it go. I nodded. That's a hard lesson. It is. He gave a tired smile. But it's the right one. Later, Ethan and I walked to the car. The porch light glowed behind us. Richard stood in the doorway, arm around Diane. Ethan started the engine and looked at me. That was good, he said. It was. Thank you for giving him a second chance. I looked at the Calloway house one more time, the flag, the shutters, the warm light in the windows. Everyone deserves the chance to do better, I said. We drove home through the dark Connecticut roads, leaves drifting across the headlights like confetti. And I thought about something I've learned over years of opening people's chests and repairing what's broken inside them. The most delicate surgeries aren't always the ones performed in operating rooms. Sometimes they happen at dinner tables, between generations, between pride and understanding. And the most powerful instrument isn't a scalpel. It's patience. The willingness to sit quietly while someone underestimates you, and then to respond not with anger, but with grace. Because the truth about dignity is simple. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to win arguments or prove points. It just needs to be present, steady and clear, until the people around it finally see what was there all along. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time when someone misjudged you, or a moment when you had to choose between anger and understanding, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about life, family, and the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated and still choose kindness, stay with us. Because the most important battles we face are rarely the loudest ones. They're the ones we win by simply refusing to lose our composure.